Hi everyone, welcome to the Highlights from Ukraine podcast, your daily audio summary of the latest news reported in the Ukrainian media. My name is Artem, and here is the news. 985 days less the Russian invasion of Ukraine. President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky informed in his evening video address that it will soon be 3 months of Ukraine's active operations in the Kursk region of Russia. He called these operations essential in replenishing Ukraine's quote-unquote exchange fund and helping to liberate people from Russian captivity. There was also a separate report from the Defense Intelligence of Ukraine and the Foreign Intelligence Service on the North Korean troops in the territory of Russia. Quote, there are already 11,000 of them in the Kursk region. We are seeing an increase in North Koreans, but unfortunately not an increase in our partners' response, unquote, said the head of state. Volodymyr Zelensky also held a meeting of the staff. A key issue discussed was air defense, due to Russia's active use of Shahed drones and aerial bombs. Quote, this terror is increasing every month. We need more countermeasures. This includes strengthening mobile fire groups, introducing the real practice of shooting down Shaheds with drones, and developing our forces in such a way as to finally solve the problem of Russian aerial bombs, unquote, said the president. There were also many questions about increasing the production of Ukrainian weapons, primarily drones and missiles. Kyiv is expanding contracts for Ukrainian manufacturers and creating long-term opportunities for them to produce weapons and invest in developing such manufacturing. Earlier, Zelensky informed that there is an increase in supply from partners for the front according to support packages, for example, in the supply of artillery. We would really appreciate if you could rate us, ideally with 5 stars, and leave a glowing review in the app where you're listening to this podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and others. This really helps more people to find out about the highlights from Ukraine and truth about Russia's invasion. Andriy Yermak, head of President's Office of Ukraine, has affirmed that Kyiv is not conducting any negotiations with Russia, reports Ukrainska Pravda. The Financial Times recently reported, citing informed sources, that Ukraine and Russia were engaged in preliminary talks about halting strikes on each other's energy infrastructure. The Kremlin dismissed the reports as fake news, denying that there have been any such discussions with Kyiv. Yermak also denied, quote, these reports from certain sources that there are supposedly negotiations going on between Ukraine and Russia are completely untrue, unquote, said the head of President's office. According to him, in reality, Ukraine held thematic conferences. The first one was on energy security and was held online with Qatar as co-organizer. During these conference, participants established principles concerning this point in the peace formula. All these thematic conferences are held without Russia. In response to a follow-up question about whether any partners had requested Ukraine to refrain from targeting specific facilities within Russia, Yermak said, quote, let's put it this way, no one has explicitly requested anything from us, but we know that countries would support agreements on, say, energy security if there were 2 such agreements with Qatar or another country as an intermediary, unquote. Journalists at Radio Liberty have analyzed the draft quote-unquote peace agreement that Russia presented to Ukraine in the early days of the full-scale invasion. The agreement demanded that Ukraine reduce the size of its army, relinquish arms, recognize the so-called Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, finance the rebuilding of Donbas, lift sanctions from Russia, and reinstate Soviet symbols in the country. The draft, titled Agreement on Regulating the Situation in Ukraine and Ukrainian Neutrality, is dated 7th March 2022, 11 days after Russia's invasion and 1 week after the start of Ukrainian-Russian negotiations. It was drawn up by the Kremlin and presented during the 3rd round of talks in Belarus. Radio Liberty obtained the document from a Ukrainian source, and the Russian source close to the negotiations has confirmed its authenticity. Had the Ukrainian authorities accepted these conditions, it would have turned Ukraine into a puppet entity with a nominal neutral status, with a tiny toothless army, devoid of NATO protection, and with no chance of regaining control over Crimea or Donbas. Ukraine would have been forced to recognize the independence of Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts in their entirety, as well as large territories that were still under Kyiv's control at that time. The Kremlin demanded that Ukraine's army be reduced to 50,000 troops, including 1,500 officers. The country would also have had only 4 ships, 55 helicopters, and 300 tanks. In addition, Ukraine was to undertake not to develop, produce, purchase, or deploy on its territory missile weapons with a range of more than 250 kilometers. Russia also reserved the right to ban Ukraine from using any other type of weapons that may be developed as a result of scientific research in the future. Ukraine would also have to rebuild Donbas infrastructure destroyed since 2014 at its own expense. Russia also insisted that Russian language be recognized as an official language in Ukraine. Thank you for listening to the Highlights from Ukraine podcast. We're a commercial initiative of just two people, and we need your help to grow. Share information about the podcast, rate us in the app, subscribe to our Patreon. With your support, we are getting better. We call on you to demand from governments of your countries to impose the toughest sanctions possible on Russia and its citizens to stop their invasion of Ukraine.